PC budget gaming. Lots of tough decisions to make there. Pretty much anybody will tell you that you should spend the most money on three things: your graphics card, power supply, and CPU. The graphics card is what actually puts the images on the screen while you're playing. You'll want as nice of one as you can get. Your power supply is responsible for pushing electrons out to all your components while you're really stressing your hardware. A bad one can toast everything inside your machine. And your CPU is responsible for, well, pretty much everything else. Today, we're talking about the CPU. When you're talking budget gaming, particularly in the ultra-cheap sub-$50 range, you're probably going to have to make a choice. You can have a dual-core CPU with a high clock speed, or you can have an older quad or 6-core CPU with a lower clock speed. So which one should you get? To answer that question, we've got two systems we're going to use to run a range of games with a variety of super-budget graphics cards. Keep in mind that a better CPU won't increase your frame rates and graphics quality anything like a better GPU, but especially in heavy physics-based 3D games, a better CPU will definitely improve the smoothness of your gaming experience. Now, a caveat. If you're willing to pay about $30 more on your system, you can probably get a hyper-threaded dual-core chip that has both a high clock speed and 4 threads. Not quite as good as 4 physical cores on the actual chip, but that will probably change the results of this test quite a bit. This information is going to be best for the folks looking to build a PC using crap they found at a thrift store or garage sale for around $30 total. First, the test systems. On the left, in what is probably the most ghastly PC case I've ever seen, and which has been very appropriately named, we have an Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600 with 4 cores clocked at 2.4 GHz and 8 MB of L2 cache. It launched in 2007 and was close to the very top of Intel's consumer line of processors at the time. Also on the board in this box is 6 GB of DDR2 RAM with a maximum bandwidth of 1 GB per second. On the right, in what I will maintain forever is the prettiest desktop tower case ever made, we have an Intel Pentium G3258 with 2 cores clocked at 3.2 GHz and 3 MB of L2 cache. It launched in 2014, but unlike the Q6600, it was very near the bottom of Intel's consumer line at the time. It does have an unlocked multiplier, meaning that it can be overclocked, but for this round of testing we'll be running it at its base clock speed. Also on board in this box is 8 GB of DDR3 RAM with a maximum bandwidth of 10 GB per second, since one of the sticks is limited to the slower 1066 MHz speed. I've chosen these CPUs for a few reasons. First of all, because the Haswell chips are becoming more common in the used market, and prices for these Pentiums have recently started to fall pretty quickly, while the Core 2 Quad is still the most common quad-core processor I see in this price range. But more importantly, I've chosen these chips because in synthetic benchmarks, while the Q6600 lags far behind the G3258 in single-core scores, both chips are within 100 points of each other in terms of their multi-core processing scores. That means that the gaming benefits of a multi-cored system versus a higher clock speed system will be pretty readily visible in the data because the raw power of the chip suggests they should be pretty equal in terms of performance. I'll also be using 3 graphics cards to test both systems, so we've got lots of data points. Each of these cards are super budget offerings, especially the 2 from AMD, but even the much newer Nvidia model should be available for less than $20 on a site like eBay. From left to right, we have the Radeon R5 240 with 2 gigs of DDR3 RAM, the Radeon HD 6450 with 1 gig of GDDR3 RAM, and the GeForce GT 630 with 1 gig of DDR3. All 3 cards will be running with the latest drivers available in Windows 10 and at their base clock speeds. The games I selected include Half-Life 2 from 2005, Tomb Raider from 2013, and Rise of the Tomb Raider from 2016. These games span over 10 years of AAA game development and also include reliable in-game benchmarks. I also ran all 6 system configurations through the 3D Mark CloudGate benchmark, and what the hey, let's start right there. All the test footage shown was captured on each system with the GT 630 installed. Now, let's be clear. Neither of these systems, no matter the configuration, is a gaming powerhouse. But for older or less complicated games, both would be functional and deliver a satisfactory gaming experience. In the CloudGate benchmark, the Q6600 netted 2276, 2668, and 5138 for the R5 240, the HD 6450, and GT 630 respectively. That's just an arbitrary scale, of course, but it equates to average frame rates of 9 FPS, 10.5 FPS, and 24.3 FPS for each of those graphics cards again respectively. In comparison, the dual-core G3258 managed scores of 2369, 2719, and 5213, with average frame rates of 9.5, 10.8, and 24.4 on the R5, the HD, and the GT, respectively. On average, those are improvements of right around 5% and indicate a frame rate increase of half a frame per second. That might sound trivial, and, well, it is pretty trivial, but the increased overall score does indicate that the 3.2 GHz G3258 should run games at a slightly more consistent frame rate, holding more steadily around that average frame rate instead of dipping down to the observed low of 7 FPS on the Q6600. Next, we have Half-Life 2 running in high settings in 1080p on the fugly Q6600 system, which saw average frame rates of 33.5, 34.5, and 190.3 for the R5 240, HD 6450, and GT 630 respectively. Definitely playable frame rates across the board, even for the older and far less powerful Radeon cards, though pretty clearly the 190 frames pumped out by the newer Nvidia card were buttery smooth in this older title. Moving over to the Pentium G3258 system, we see Half-Life 2 return an average of 34 FPS for the R5 240, a hair's breadth quicker than the 33.5 frames on the quad-core system. The HD 6450, with its higher clock speed and increased memory bandwidth, however, saw 38.7 FPS, which is a marked improvement. A marked improvement that pales vastly in comparison to the GT 630 paired with the G3258, which returned an average frame rate of 225.9 FPS, which obviously blows the Q6600 system completely out of the water and sets up the Pentium system as the pretty clear winner in our 2005 game. Fast forward to 2013 and the release of Tomb Raider. At this point, the very well-aged Radeon cards started to show their, age. Even at the low preset in 1080p, the R5 240 and HD 6450 barely managed to push out 11.2 FPS and 11.4 FPS respectively when paired with the Q6600. The GT 630, on the other hand, managed a fairly playable average of 30.2 FPS, which for a third-person game like this is pretty acceptable. Tomb Raider, though, tells a very similar story to Half-Life 2 when we move over to the Pentium G3258 base system. The Radeon cards managed to push 18.6 and 21 average FPS for the R5 240 and HD 6450 respectively, and the GT 630 managed a very fluid 48 FPS on average, at one point even hitting the game's capped 60 frames per second maximum. So this looks like another case where the dual-core but significantly faster clocked CPU comes out on top, leaving things looking pretty grim for our aging quad-core system. Finally, we've got Rise of the Tomb Raider, one of the objectively prettiest games of 2016, running at literally the lowest settings possible at 1080p. You're probably expecting a pretty lousy slog here, so let's get this over with. Somewhat surprisingly, the Q6600 system managed 11.5 FPS, 10.6 FPS, and 32.7 FPS for the R5 240, HD 6450, and GT 630 respectively. Those numbers are within a frame of the averages on Tomb Raider, with the Nvidia card managing 2 FPS better on average, leaving a very low fidelity yet still reasonably playable game behind. Now, moving over to the G3258 system, we saw average frame rates of 7.4 FPS, 7.8 FPS, and 22.6. The heck is going on here? All three cards saw a decrease in frame rate over the 2013 Tomb Raider by 50%, with the HD 6450 configuration barely managing to push a third of the frames of the 2013 game. Well, that's maybe not surprising considering Rise of the Tomb Raider is 3 years newer and far more graphically intensive. What's mind-blowing is that this puts the Q6600 system a solid 30% better in terms of average frame rates than the so far consistently victorious Pentium G3258. This bears out in the feel of the actual gameplay. Half-Life 2 obviously runs smoothly enough on both machines that it's difficult to really tell the difference while you're playing, but in Tomb Raider the difference is more pronounced. On the Q6600 system, the frame rate regularly dips and introduced apparent input lag in wide open areas, though the game is playable by and large. On the G3258, Tomb Raider feels smoother, with the frame rate remaining more stable, and dips into the teens are fewer and further between. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, on the other hand, gameplay on the Q6600 feels very similar to the earlier Tomb Raider title, with fairly regular frame rate dips and input lag in very open areas that make the game unwieldy, but with the majority of the game managing a fairly playable 30 FPS. If you set the difficulty low, you could conceivably play through the entire game this way without wanting to gouge your own eyes out. On the G3258, well, the game feels worse. It's choppier, and even with less going on, the game is just harder to play than on the quad-core system. Even with a clock speed that trumps the Q6600 by nearly a full gigahertz and vastly superior system memory bandwidth, the G3258 could not keep up with the 7-year-older quad-core CPU on the newest game tested. So what kind of conclusion should we be drawing from this? Well, it's that, hilariously, buying the older CPU with more cores will actually yield better results in newer games. Games designed to run on older hardware are typically made to take the best advantage they can of a low core count, because there were still lots of computers that were running with a single-core processor back when Half-Life 2 was developed. By contrast, the vast majority of computers today have a quad-core CPU, and so modern games are designed to utilize as many cores as they can for simultaneous processing. So, if you're building a budget gaming PC to play games from about 2013 and older, go for the higher clock speed. That will consistently give you better results. If your plan is to play games that are newer, however, get the lower clocked CPU with more cores. That's going to be the best bang for your buck, and the Core 2 Quad is still a pretty valid option in that budget space.